Ben Domenech is joining us now, Fox News contributor and editor-at-large of The Spectator. Ben, what are we supposed to make of the 4,000% increase in Chinese nationals coming over the border?
You know, I have to say, when we come up with the idea of having, laws that are designed to allow people to escape from the most horrid conditions, laws that allow them to claim asylum in situations where their lives are at stake, the justification of Syria is very weird right now is not something that was intended. That's not the way that's supposed to work. And, look, I understand, your earlier quotation from Senator Graham. I understand that he says we need to do something now on the border. But there are two different things that need to happen. One is to have a larger approach to this, which I think should wait until Republicans have the opportunity to retake the White House and to not have this be done under the auspices of the extremely progressive Biden administration on this front. But on the flip side, I think that the demand to have the laws on the books enforced and to be enforced according to their actual priorities is one that has to be hammered away at by everyone within, who cares about the border within both parties. That's something that I think the president is probably going to have to address in his upcoming State of the Union. They've been teasing the idea that he's going to do some things when it comes to executive orders and the like to try to clamp down on this. But the truth is that this is a situation of their own choosing, of this administration's own choosing. And the porous borders, whether it's into the north or in the south, are obviously now leading to whole populations of people coming into the country who we have never seen before. It's really unprecedented, as Bill Melugin was just saying, to see this kind of sizable population coming from places like China, from places like Syria. It's like nothing we've ever seen before, and it needs to be addressed as soon as possible. We can't wait for another election to deal with this.
And we see these changing epicenters, obviously, with those live pictures on California and Texas, Ben. And meanwhile, a new opinion piece by our own Joe Concha is titled "Hiding Biden, AWOL as America Faces Crisis After Crisis, the border crisis just being the one of them." It also notes the fallout from special counsel Robert Hur's report earlier this month. Biden's terrible polling, continued high prices hurting Americans, and the crime crisis driving people out of blue cities. Just an excerpt from it. This election year, we have an octogenarian president who keeps insisting he is the only man for the job, yet acting like an absentee landlord of the country he's supposed to lead. So what's going to happen here, Ben?
Well, in sports, you have the idea of a replacement level player, somebody who can come in and basically deliver on what you expect from what's current. The fact is that, as Nate Silver is now writing, no Republican Biden is acting like a below replacement level president. He's not someone who is capable of delivering on the kind of promises that he made to people back in 2020 about addressing all the different crises the nation is facing. And in fact, he's created more of them. He's led directly his foreign policy weakness has led directly, I believe, to the war in Ukraine. His weakness on the border has led to this type of chaos. And I don't believe that, they really have any plan within the White House to roll him out there and offer anything that can give Americans confidence going into November. That's why I think Democrats behind the scenes and increasingly in public are sounding the alarm about the need for something major to adjust on the part of the White House's strategy or potentially for Joe Biden to be replaced, which, again, they can do all the way up until the convention in August and even beyond that.
You had that denial of the crisis at the border, the downplaying of it, now the acknowledgement of it, yet we still aren't seeing the president down there doing something physically about it, Ben. Meanwhile, just 5 days until South Carolina's Republican presidential primary, and the state's former governor is pushing hard for votes.
We need someone who can serve 8 years, fully working, fully disciplined, and ready to get the job done. We can't go and take the chance of doing this with two 80-year-olds. I look at where we started. There were 14 candidates in the race. We've defeated a dozen of the fellas. I just have one more fella to catch up to.
That one fella is former President Donald Trump. Polls show Haley way behind, however, in her home state. One Republican strategist says she must be running a, quote, statement campaign, adding you want to campaign to win, and there's no path to victory for her. And so she must be running for some other reason. Ben, to her point, though, she did thin the field, but she's still a long way away from Donald Trump in those polls.
Yeah, surviving past, the likes of Doug Burgum, I mean, as much as you can respect his political career, is not exactly something that boosts you to the point of being the nominee. Look, I'll be down in South Carolina all this week in my own haunting grounds in North Charleston and Columbia and Greenville. And I think that one of the things that I'm going to be, hearing from a lot of the, people who are down there is that they like Nikki Haley, that they liked her as governor, but that they just don't think that she's the right person for the job right now, that they would prefer to run into this next election with Donald Trump, which is what we hear from most Republicans when we talk to them. I think that this is an election that where, Nikki Haley has kind of made her statement already about who she is. She wants to have a political career, I think, going forward. And so I don't think that she's going to last much further beyond her home state. In fact, I think you may end up in a situation where Donald Trump ends up winning every state on the way to the nomination.
Wow. Well, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu with this prediction, if former President Trump is the 2024 Republican nominee.
The fear is that if Trump is the nominee, ultimately Biden wins and the next president of the United States is actually Kamala Harris. That's a reality of the domino effect that Trump would have in America.
Wow. What do you say to that?
I think Governor Sununu, certainly is right to raise the possibility that you could end up in a situation with a President Kamala Harris. But at this point, I'm not sure that people would be as scared of that as a President Joe Biden. But I think that the simple fact is this is an argument that they've been making ever since day one, really, on the Republican side. And enough people have heard it, and they've decided that they're still willing to take that risk, in part because of what Trump stands for, what he represents, and because they trust him on issues like the border that we are talking about today, more than they do almost any other politician in the country. That's been a big difference. It's been a big boost to him. And I think that what we're going to see is that the weaker Joe Biden looks as we go along this year, the more that argument is going to fade into the background.
To your earlier point about Kamala Harris and those that might actually want to see her over him, Charlemagne the God made that very point over the weekend, right? About Biden lacking inspiration and possibly Kamala Harris would offer more. Okay, Ben, great to have you on the program today. Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.